The year was 2003. Grand Chase was being released. A hub-based MMO with a 2D perspective, the game set itself apart from others of its time. With its unique gameplay, Grand Chase provided players with an experience that can still be considered fairly unique, even by today's standards. This was my first MMO. The memories I have of this game are priceless. It opened my eyes to a whole new world. For many years, Grand Chase lived on as a fairly popular game. However, during the year of 2015, 12 years after its debut, Grand Chase had its days numbered. COG, the company behind the game, decided they would no longer release any updates or new content for the game, choosing instead to focus on new projects. And with that, Grand Chase ended, despite having a still fairly numerous player base. However, fast forward to the year 2021, and out of the blue, Grand Chase Classic is announced. It was said to be a revival of the old Grand Chase. Before some of its more questionable updates, it was supposed to bring players back to the original game that they had so many memories of, just as seen before with the likes of World of Warcraft. On launch day, the game was packed full of players, reaching a peak of 79,000 players on Steam. So many players, in fact, that it became clear that COG wasn't expecting that many people were going to play it, with new servers being added every day to try and accommodate to all the new players looking to enjoy the game. Despite the high numbers of players, the launch didn't take place without its problems. The game, for one thing, was extremely laggy, perhaps even worse than its previous 2003 iteration, which for a 2021 title was unacceptable. Another problem was that many changes were made to the game's cash shop and overall balance. Certain items in the game required ludicrous amounts of money, more than 10 times what it would take in the game's original iteration. The game's characters were nerfed considerably as well, with some losing even core mechanics, like Alice's losing her dodge mechanic. Needless to say, players were not happy about this. COG stated that this nerfing was done so as to balance the game correctly and make sure the content would remain enjoyable. However, it was clear to players that this was only a way to increase demand for the cash items and increase profits as a direct consequence. The game was also full of players utilizing mana hacks and invincibility hacks in PvP. A fair amount of players were also abusing glitches so as to obtain limited event items multiple times. As a response, COG came up with a huge ban wave that unfortunately targeted even honest players. It didn't have anything to do with the violations. Support tickets were sent to the company asking for their situation to be reviewed, in hopes that COG would do what any company was expected to do in that situation, and at least consider their appeals. What followed, however, was nothing more than automated responses that were sent days and sometimes weeks after the original requests, showing that this was a deeply mismanaged company with awful customer service practices. Overworked or not, when players pay money on a game and are unjustly banned, they deserve at least a real response from a worker. Finally, there was another decision made by COG that infuriated the majority of players. The game launched with only 4 of its previous 20 characters and was missing 4 continents. Again, COG stated that this was done so as they would have time to balance the game properly. However, once more players accused the company of foul play, with most believing that it was merely an excuse so as to try and maintain as much hype surrounding the game as possible, without needing to create any new content, just holding back characters and continents so as to keep players in the game waiting for their favorite characters to be released. Despite a lot of backlash, a fair number of players still believed that the remaining content would be released fairly quickly, as they continued to play the game. And after 1 week of waiting, it was finally announced. Ryan was about to be released, 2 weeks away from the game's initial launch. Needless to say, this infuriated much of the player base, as after 2 weeks, all they were getting was one character. If this was to be the pace of all the content, then it would surely be ages before players had the chance to experience the game's original state. Nevertheless, many players endured, believing future content was to come sooner, and lo and behold, following the exact same pattern, the next character was announced. After these events, the already dwindling player base became more and more scarce. What started as a game with dozens of servers full to their limits now became a game that could only keep one server full, that lost almost 80% of its launch day population. Despite that, at a character's release date, many players would come back to the game and servers would fill up once again. In the next few days, the drop would begin anew. To this day, all of these problems remain, not a single one truly fixed, and none of the content release decisions reconsidered. COG has shown itself to be one of the worst companies to ever manage a game, with a terrible attitude towards its players, focused only on profits, and unwilling to listen and look to its player base's needs, incapable of even recognizing the slow death of the game they revived, which could have been so easily avoided. Ever since the launch, the number of active players has been plummeting, and the trend doesn't show any signs of reversal, with the game now averaging out at 2,000 active players on Steam, or 2.5% of its original player base. It was with great sadness that I abandoned the game that once gave me such joy, and stood out to me as one of the greatest MMOs I have ever played.